expected from Blake's question then. We've had some technical difficulties. We should now be live on YouTube and Twitter, or X, and we have an explosive debate for you today. So for the last few weeks, the internet has been ablaze with chatter about a rabbi from the past, Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was a hugely influential rabbi in both America and in Israel, where he was a member of the Knesset. And the conversation online has been really revolving about one of his major statements, which is around coexistence. Can Jews and Arabs share Israel? To debate this today, I've got two huge personalities joining us on the Israel advocacy movement. We've got Blake Flayton and Uri Kurlianchik, and Blake's going to be arguing that Kahane was wrong, and Uri's going to be arguing that he was right. And so I'm going to hand it over to both of them to introduce themselves while I check if everything is working as it should be, because it hasn't been for the last few minutes, and apologize that we're running late. So Uri, over to you.
Yes. So I was born in Moscow in the Soviet Union. I made Aliyah when I was 4, though I still speak Russian to my family. And I grew up in Rehovot. I presently live in Samaria, in a small, completely secular town. My background is basically role-playing games, fantasy fiction. I've only started being politically active at late 2022, maybe the start of 2023. And since then, I've mostly been active on Twitter and on Substack. And I have recently been published in The Spectator and The National Review, but I still sense like I'm making my first baby steps in the field of journalism as opposed to fiction and role-playing games. And that's basically my background.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Blake, and I am an American Israeli. I got my start. Well, first, let me say that I grew up in the States, and before I moved to Israel, I had every intention of being a progressive left-wing activist in the United States until I encountered anti-Semitism on my college campus from left-wing peers and from the left-wing activist space that I was frequently involved in. And that caused quite a rude awakening for me, which I wrote about in a piece that was published in the New York Times when I was in college. And since then, I've continued writing for a variety of publications, including Haaretz and Tablet Magazine and the Free Press, and several others. And I made Aliyah 2.5 years ago. And since making Aliyah, I've continued in the pro-Israel advocacy space. I had a book come out last week called 10 Things Every Jew Should Know Before They Go to College. Mm-hmm. And I hope to be joining the IDF later this year, hopefully in the summer. It was supposed to be this spring, but what can I say? It's a hell of a bureaucracy. Yeah. And I also have my own Substack. It's called Bourgeois Nationalist, which I'm sure Yuri knows was a Soviet epithet used against comrades who never quite let go of their Judaism despite all the pressure. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much it. That's the Cliff Notes version.
Perfect. And before we jump into the actual debate, I'm going to try and share a quick clip which would really help orientate the conversation. This is from Meir Kahane, from an interview maybe 50 years ago, I think. And hopefully it works. So I'm now going to share my screen. Blake, Uri, let me know if you can't hear it, and we'll abandon the video. So let me just do that.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to share my screen. Okay.
I'm here to, first of all, to point out to American Jews that the problem of the West Bank is an insoluble one if we keep on thinking in terms of coexistence. The Arabs believe it is their country. I understand the Arabs. I respect the Arabs. There is no coexistence possible with them. They have to leave.
Perhaps it is time to have peaceful coexistence. You say there can be none. You want the Arabs to leave.
Right.
The Arabs say, the Palestinians say that it is their homeland. Why should they leave?
Because they want me to leave. and I understand them, and I respect them. I understand the Arabs, and the Arabs understand me, and neither of us could understand you, and neither of us can understand the Jewish leaders who speak about sharing the country. The Arabs believe it's all theirs. Why should they share it with foreigners? The Arabs are not speaking about the West Bank. Before there was a 1967 war, what was bothering the Arabs then? Why did the Arabs not accept the UN plan of 1947, which would have given them the West Bank and a great deal more as a so-called Palestine state? The answer is that they believe that Tel Aviv is as much Arab as Hebron. And I understand that, but it is not, because both are really Jewish. And therefore, since they have 22 countries, God bless each and every one of them, I want them to live in any one or all of those countries, and let me have my one country.
Okay, so hopefully you all were you able to hear the audio then? Okay,
Yes.
and so that now frames the debate. So for the audience, you now know who we're discussing, we know what we're discussing, and I'm going to hand it over to Uri to argue the case. He's going to open for around 7 minutes, and then Blake's going to give his opening remarks that Kahane was wrong.
Okay, so first of all, I want to get a little philosophical, if I may. When we say right or wrong, it's not binary. It's a spectrum. Everything is on the spectrum of being right and wrong. So I'm not going to defend everything that Kahane has ever said or done, because there are some things that I am sure even his closest associates didn't agree with. Instead, I want to defend the position of a population transfer, which until that not long ago wasn't at all a controversial position. A person actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping arrange a population exchange, because that was always historically seen as an alternative to massive bloodshed and even genocide. Like, I'm sure that even in the days of ancient Assyrian, ancient Babylon, people said, okay, they're such nice people. They transfer the population instead of, massacring everyone like someone else would. So first of all, that is a position that comes from a place of humanity, of compassion, not from a place of brutality. So, and also when we say Arabs, what do we mean? Because if you speak to most Arab people, they will say that there are Arab people, there are Arabized people. So, like, who do we call Arabs? Everyone who speaks Arabic, everyone who speaks Arabic and is a Muslim, because they would tell you, that half of Israel are Arab Jews. Okay, so I'm having this introduction because that kind of limits the subject. So one of the reasons people are against a population transfer is because they say it's not pragmatic. It cannot be done. And I claim that, prove it to me. They say the world won't let you. Okay, the world is asking us to do it right now. Trump is asking to do that. And it has happened many times before. And I'm talking about the days of Assyria and Rome and whatever. I'm talking about, Bhutan. They expelled about 1/6 of their population. The Armenian population in the region recently conquered by Azerbaijan fled. It was done in Myanmar, in Algeria. They expelled all the non-Muslims. After World War II, the Allies expelled millions of ethnic Germans. The Turks expelled hundreds of thousands of Greeks from Cyprus. The Russians expelled a huge amount of Georgians from Abkhazia and Ossetia. So those things happen all the time, but people just don't talk about them. It kind of goes under the radar. So it's not something extreme. It's not something which is extraordinary. It's something which is very natural. Now, what do we gain from ruling over people who don't want to be ruled by us? We don't benefit anything from it. We're not an empire. We were not making them work for us. We don't want to do that. We don't want to force our religion on them. We don't want to force our principles told them, so we don't benefit from it, and they certainly don't benefit from it. I'm sure nobody in Gaza is very happy right now about the state of affairs, and I don't think most people in the West Bank are very happy about it. So I don't see the negatives. Like, if it works out, I think that eventually everyone will benefit from it. And notice that I didn't say anything about, God-given land. I didn't bring any quotes from the Bible, because I think that is not something which is just moral, but it's also something which is expedient. And I also believe that it can be done in a way which, in the near future, everyone will feel they have benefit from it. And now, I think the touchy subject here is Arabs who are Israeli citizens, because how can you come to a person who serves in the IDF, a person who is without doubt an Israeli patriot, and tell him, you're not a real Israeli, you have to go? That is the part where I think many Kach supporters would disagree with me. I say that, no, not every person who is Israeli and Muslim should be viewed as an enemy. We should treat different communities differently. Obviously, the way, for example, which Israel is viewed in Abu Ghosh is different from the way Israel is viewed in Rahat, from the way Israel is viewed in the Triangle, like Wadi Ara. So in this regard, I'm not saying that Arab Israelis are necessarily enemies. I think a lot of change since Kahane was unfortunately murdered. I think that what he said was correct when he said it, but since then there has been some progress. I'm talking about Israel, not about the territories. So that is one position. That is why I spoke about the spectrum earlier. That is one position which I want 100% defend. Otherwise, as I said, it's both moral and expedient.
Okay, and if that's your opening remarks, then Blake, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ori. And thank you, Joseph, of course, for moderating. So the way that I want to frame this conversation is different from the way that people would expect somebody to begin an argument against Kahane, against Kach, against Kahanism as we understand it today and as it was understood then. And what I mean by that is I'm not going to center the Palestinians. The Palestinians are a population that the Israelis have been at war with for 76 plus years. And to be honest, in the midst of this current war, I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the Palestinians, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza, because I believe in awarding people agency and not denying people agency based on the color of their skin or their religion or their placement into false binaries of oppressor and oppressed. What I am going to do is frame this conversation about what is good for Israelis and what is not good for Israelis. And I'm going to go into several areas of conversation to that end. The first is, when people say, and this goes to why we're having this conversation, it's because somebody posted a video of Kahane on Instagram, and it set off this firestorm of people criticizing the propagation of Kahane's views, because the comment under the video said, Mayor Kahane of blessed memory. And then once this person who posted it received backlash, she created a video and said, well, I didn't agree with everything Kahane said. And that's quite convenient. And I believe it's a cop-out. Because the question on the table is, was Kahane right or was Kahane wrong? And the fundamental central characteristic of Kahane was that Jews and Arabs, of Kahanism, was that Jews and Arabs cannot live together in the land. There is no Kahanism, there is no Kahane in Israel without that central argument, that central hypothesis. And you only need to spend a day in Israel to understand how that central hypothesis has been proven wrong. You can go to any mixed city in the country, and even predominantly Jewish cities in the country, and even predominantly Arab cities in the country, and you will see Jews and Arabs interacting with each other all the time. Arab Israelis are pharmacists, they are lawyers, they are doctors, they serve on the Supreme Court. Kahane did not make a distinction between Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza and Arabs in Israel itself. Ori would like to make, I know we're not supposed to be getting into rebuttals, but just part of my opening statement, I will say that when the question on the table is Kahane right or wrong, that is a centerpiece of his argument, that there is no difference between Arabs in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. Empirically, that has been proven false. Since October 7th, there has decidedly not been a mass expression of disloyalty or rebellion against the state by the more than 20% of Arabs in Israel. There actually has been great acts of service by the Arab population in Israel, considering Arabs too were murdered by Hamas on October 7th, and considering Arabs, especially Druze people who are considered Arabs, join the army and are incredibly loyal to the state of Israel. Kahanism in practice would mean, the praxis of Kahanism, if you will, would mean that the young people who are drafted to serve in the IDF to protect their country are then tasked with the responsibility of going in to Arab neighborhoods in this country and Arab homes in mixed cities and forcing people to leave. That is what Kahanism in practice looks like. Even in the West Bank, I think it is morally unsalvageable, and it would do irreparable damage to Israel's conscience and its civic contract and its understanding of itself as a liberal democracy to have soldiers, young people, carry out such an order. It, I believe, would bring upon consequences and international condemnation and sanctions and an economic strangling that we can barely conceive of now. That's the first part, is the moral part. The second part is security. The idea that you can remove millions of people from a territory into hostile territory, states, countries that already don't believe that your country has a right to exist, and those countries are not going to respond, or those countries are not going to take you to task militarily because of that forced population movement, is a fallacy. It's a fantasy. Egypt, nor Jordan, nor Syria, nor Lebanon is with open arms about to take in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians, especially because the entire ethos of Palestinianism is rejection of a Jewish state. So from a security vantage point, Kahanism is not viable from a moral standpoint and from a security standpoint. And I will also argue that we have seen the effects of Kahanism on Israeli society through its emissaries over the past few decades, particularly in the past several years, with parties in the Knesset that are carrying the torch of his racist ideology. And they have done nothing to make Israel safer. Instead, they have sown civic division and civic distrust and really chaos in the West Bank. People forget that before October 7th, there was a terror attack in the West Bank almost every single day, and we will get to that in further discussions. But the people who have ushered in Kahanism in Israel in our modern age today have brought no security, no trust. They have done everything in their power to unravel the values and the foundations that Israel was built on.
Okay, and so both very strong and convincing arguments. And so now we're going to move to 5 minutes of rebuttals. So Uri, I'll hand it over to you to respond to what Blake just said.
Okay, So Blake here raised several points, and they're very good and very interesting points. I'll try to address each point. I took some notes. So first of all, you spoke about those countries not responding militarily. And why does it have to be Egypt, for example? Egypt is a sovereign state. We can't force Egypt to do anything. Egypt is also a state which has a population at least, I think, 10 times more than Israel, probably even more. But there are almost 200 countries in this world. If you open the doors, first of all, if you encourage immigration, help everyone who wants to leave, because there's a huge difference between the collective and the individual. As a collective, as Mayor Kahane said, the Arabs are very steadfast. They hold to the land. They are very tough. They're very fearless. You have to give it to them. But as individuals, maybe someone wants his children to have better opportunities. Maybe he wants to get better wages for their work, and maybe they can find this in other places which will accept them. Not as some kind of an epic expulsion like in ancient Assyria, but if you just open the gates, if you just give this option to people, first of all, see what happens. I'm not saying that everyone will get up and leave instantly. Honestly, obviously, this won't happen. But if you give people this option, some people will leave. Some people will want to go to other places, and these places will accept them because honestly, they're better immigrants than many of the immigrants which are being accepted, in the sense that they have better experience with labor, they have better experience in working in more advanced industries. So they're more attractive as immigrants, and why should it be Egypt? They can go to Morocco, Puntland, Canada, Ireland. I know, and again, there are 200 countries. So if a few thousand go here, a few thousand go there, you won't have this huge concentration. Specifically in regards to Jordan, I think this country is about to collapse in the near future. I don't think the Hashemite house will hold it for very long. There will be chaos. And just like there is, for example, the situation in Syria is very dynamic right now. You have the alliance with the Druze, the alliance with the Kurds, changing internal borders. I think something like that can happen in Jordan, and we should be ready to exploit it. I'm not saying let's invade Jordan, but this will probably happen in and of itself if you look at the demographics and the way this country is headed. Now, you also mentioned the moral aspect, and morality is a tool. It's not something which exists in nature. And every tool is good for some purposes and not good for other purposes. For example, a hammer is very good to put a nail on the wall. It's not so good to paint this wall. So peacetime morality and wartime morality are different things. I don't think it's correct to use peacetime morality in a situation of war. And again, the first stage I'm talking about is not breaking to people's house and throwing them outside like the Soviet Union did. Just encouraging, giving them this option to see how it goes. Because right now we're not even doing that. And the final thing you said is about the current parties only resulting in less security. I completely agree with you. But if you look at their actual policies, not what they say, they haven't done any of those things. Their actual policies have been dovish. Their actual policies until 7th October has been of appeasement, of aiding the enemy. They haven't done any of those things they said they will do. They only spoke about it. So if you put their words aside and just look at their actions, the actual difference between even Bibi and Meretz is not that big. So we don't know what happens if you actually do that, because no one has even tried to do that. We have some people who spoke about it to get the votes of the people who support it, but they have done absolutely nothing, even remotely, in this direction. So I hope I addressed all your points.
Okay, so Blake, over to you.
Yeah, so there's this interesting contradiction for people who are in support of the notion, the contention that Kahane was right. And that is the contention that the Arabs are fearless and that they are brave and that they will die fighting for the land, and that we should respect them because of that conviction. And that's kind of a Jabotinsky right argument, that they're never going to stop fighting for the land. But then in the same breath, they say, well, once you open the gates and allow people to leave the West Bank and Gaza, or even Israel proper, then, we'll see what happens. Maybe there could be a transfer that is not, as you said, like an ancient Assyrian, like expulsion, right? Or something medieval or something, that's a crime in the eyes of international law. And those two ideas are in complete contradiction with each other. To be a Palestinian, Palestinianism as an ideology is the rejection of the Jewish state and the idea that the Arabs have the superior right to this land, the exclusive superior right to this land. I can't stress enough. Maybe, and I agree that the option to leave Gaza should have been available on October 8th, since the start of this war. But I cannot stress enough that if those gates were open, you would have a tiny fraction of people who would voluntarily leave, because they have been indoctrinated for years in an ideology that says that the Jews are usurpers, they're colonizers, they're foreigners, and that we need to fight to the last man, woman, and child until they are not here anymore. So it's a fallacy to think that, once, Hamas is defeated and we open the doors to Gaza, max, what do we think? 100,000 people, maybe 200,000 people. That still leaves about more than 1 million people in Gaza. And we're not even talking about the West Bank, in which people are extremely attached to the land and are extremely convinced that that land is, like Gaza, a launch pad to take back Greater Palestine from the river to the sea. They are not going anywhere voluntarily. The only option in support of Kahanism and Kach is transfer by force. And again, that puts the Israeli people in a position where they do have to do something like the Soviet Union. They do have to go into homes and into communities with guns, with tanks, and force people out. And I don't think that is a policy that most Israelis can look in the mirror and sleep at night having to carry out. And I will touch on what you said about, the people, the emissaries of Kahane, which I've called them, haven't really exercised Kahane's policy, and that there's no difference between Bibi and Meretz, which, that's a conversation for another time. I don't agree at all, but that's a conversation for another time. But I think that the security failures that led to October 7th grew out of a Kahane or Kahane-esque type policy, which is that very little matters other than expansion of the Israeli civilian population into the West Bank, specifically into the West Bank. Because what happens when you move Israelis into the West Bank? Well, you restrict Palestinian freedom of movement, and sooner rather than later, you make it harder for Palestinians to live there, leading to what the right wing hopes, the eventuality of Palestinians leaving. That has been Israeli state policy, particularly under right wing governments. And people in the Otzma Yehudit party now, which is the definite ideological heir of the Kach movement, say that openly. They don't hide that. They say, we want to expand settlements because it's our land and the Palestinians need to leave our land. That is a Kahanist philosophy. Itamar Ben-Gvir is a disciple of Kahane. He would never forego that ideology. And what that leads to is a situation where before October 7th, you have 80% of IDF soldiers in the West Bank. That is more soldiers than guarding the Gaza border, the Jordanian border, the Lebanese border, the Syrian border combined, okay? And 70% of that 80% in the West Bank are not guarding Israeli territory. They're guarding settlements. That is a suicidal policy. In fact, we know that on October 6th, because they wanted to do a Sukkot celebration in the West Bank, 2 squadrons were taken from the Gaza border and brought to the West Bank to protect religious ceremonies by religious nationalists in the West Bank. Who knows how many lives could have been saved if more soldiers had been guarding our sovereign border, our sovereign territory on that morning. That is a direct consequence of a Kahanist ideology that Israeli civilians need to keep expanding eastward in order to drive the Palestinians out. It is a failed policy. Its essence is failure. To blame Golda Meir for the Yom Kippur War and to blame Yitzhak Rabin for the failure of the Oslo process, for his naivete, whatever you want to call it, but to not lay the blame at the most far-right and most religious government in history and the most pro-Kahane government in Israel's history for the catastrophe of October 7th, the biggest catastrophe in Israel's history, I think is incredibly irresponsible. And again, I'm arguing this for the sake of Israelis. It's about our security. Yes, there's a moral issue when it comes to the Palestinians. No one innocent should be forced out of their homes, especially, and again, you kind of brushed over this in your rebuttal, especially Arab citizens of Israel who are loyal citizens, and Kahane did not differentiate between Arabs in the West Bank, Arabs in Gaza, and Arabs in Israel. So yes, there's that moral aspect to it too, but all in all, this is about Israelis and our character and our security.
Amazing. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we're going to go to a cross-examination where you both get to interrogate the other person and ask direct questions. And so again, Uri, Blake's just spoken, so over to you.
Okay, so we like do questions and answers?
Yeah, directly. So that was more of a rebuttal where you had like 5 minutes to respond to everything he said, but now you can ask direct questions either based on what he said or something entirely different where he directly responds. So it's more of a backwards and forwards before we go to the free flow conversation.
Okay, so first of all, you say you present it as something scandalous to kick out a hostile population, but it has been done so many times before by so many different societies, including in societies which we admire. Why do you view it as something so extreme when it's something so commonplace throughout the entirety of human history?
Well, I don't think that Arab Israelis are a hostile population. I don't think Arab Israelis are a hostile population at all. Do you believe that Arab Israelis are a hostile population? People living in some of them, yeah, but I can think of Jews who, who don't have the best interests of the state at heart. Should we throw them all out? I mean, there's a lot of people in Israel who want to throw people out. People want to throw me out because I'm like a gay, secular Tel Avivi. People don't want me in the country. There's plenty of people that I would prefer not to be in Israel, but we're stuck together. That's the foundation of a modern state, is that through a democracy, you have to mitigate different ideas and opinions. And like it or not, the majority of Arab citizens in this country are not plotting to undermine the state. They're simply not. Now, there are, of course, problems. There are issues. But I believe that when it comes to Arab Israelis, those issues are evident of just a normal majority-minority struggle. There was a struggle in America. There is a struggle in America between the white Christian majority and minorities. In every nation state, in Canada and France and the UK, there will be a struggle between the majority culture and the minority culture, and that is normal and to be expected in a democracy. So I don't think Arab Israelis are a hostile population whatsoever. I think that we could actually much better improve relations between Jews and Arabs in this country by working together in the Knesset to expand things like education, like infrastructure, things of that nature, like medicine, to make sure that no community in this country goes underserved. And by the way, I am in full support of drafting Arab Israelis into the army. Fully support, because the army is the great melting pot, and that's where Israelis learn about each other and each other's perspective and learn to live together. And I think it's a foolish policy, they're not going to be some fifth column in the army. Like it's the army. Like generals are in charge. I think that that's a foolish policy. So in other words, I'm for more integration. And in terms of whether or not it's moral to expel a quote unquote enemy population, and if we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza, forget morality for a second.
Yeah,
yes, as I said, right. So forget morality for a second. But like I said, it's not going to happen voluntarily. So you are going to have to go, and there's going to be mass violence during the process and after the process. That could mean untold damage for Israel. You're going to give 19-year-old, 20-year-old boys and women guns to go into villages and expel people? The Jewish people are not going to do that. I'm just letting you know. The Jewish people, we have too. You would, but we have a standing army and reserves. I mean, people backed out of serving in the army because of the judicial overhaul, because of the notion that the government would be able to override the Supreme Court with 65 votes. You think that everyone's going to just, say okay and pick up a gun and go do what the state tells them to do when you say you have to evict hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children from their homes? That's not going to happen. There's going to be desertion. There's going to be civil dissent. There's going to be mass protests, and it would tear the country apart because the Jewish people at our core, we're democratic. That's how we've always functioned. Think about it. The judicial overhaul brought this country to its knees. And this policy, which would be the most extreme in Israel's history, you think that would go over well?
So I would like to just point out that in 1948, 750,000 Arabs fled or were expelled from the country, and the sky didn't fall, nothing extreme happened. And secondly, as you said earlier, most of the people voted for these ideas, for politicians who haven't done them, but at least half the country would support it. And I don't think it would tear the country apart. In any case, you don't need 10 million people who would physically do that. You need a small number because realistically, if you just, as we have seen in Gaza, Israel pretty easily made 1.5 million people move. So it didn't...
with massive warfare and massive costs on our side. It was a war. And what you said about 1948, first of all, I'll say that 750,000 Palestinians weren't expelled. It's debated by historians, but it's pretty well accepted now that about a third were expelled, and that was in the throes of a regional conflict in which a Jewish community of 600,000 people was being invaded by 5 Arab armies. Right. So the circumstances
we are fighting a regional war right now. The situation isn't that different. I think there's a lot of arrogance in Israel among Jews in general. That we don't view the Palestinians as a mortal threat. We view them as, some people throwing a tantrum. And if Israelis understand that this is a mortal threat, this is an enemy that can defeat us if you give them enough time, if you treat them seriously with the respect they deserve, then you will also understand that you have to do some really harsh actions just to survive, because we don't have the luxury of just letting the situation continue.
But again, you said that we're in a regional war right now, and you're absolutely correct. Well, being in a regional war implies that you're interacting with the countries around you. If we're in a regional war, why would the region accept this policy? We would not be able to control. It's not like we're going to make a deal with Germany or Spain or America, because they're not going to want the Palestinians either. So we can't just move hundreds of thousands of people into a territory that is hostile to our country and expect things to go over well. And I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you that Israelis need to understand that the Palestinians are a mortal enemy. But you know what I would say to that? It is lunacy to identify something correctly as a moral enemy and then say, well, the solution to this problem is to expand our civilian population into their territory and just hope for the best, hope for this pie in the sky dream. Right. But that's what we've been doing.
I agree
but that's
with
what we've been doing, and it's done nothing for our security.
I agree with you 100% because we have been doing the opposite of what I spoke about. I want to bring like a really extreme example from the 19th century. When the Russian Empire moved into the North Caucasus, so General Yermolov, who commanded the Russian army, said, we need Circassia, but we don't need the Circassians. And the Russians just conquered this area and they pushed out the population. Honestly, that was a genocide. Without doubt, that was a genocide. That was something horrific and brutal. And there are some descriptions from there that sound like October 7. Not something that I'd encourage. They would send the Cossacks and just... But the point is that it happened. And again, it's something which people barely even address. So that thing that happened. And the Russian Empire didn't ask itself, where will these people go? How will they go? So we're mixing two issues here, the moral issue and the expedient issue. So I think we should address these issues separately. You're saying it's not moral and it's not practical. So I want to ask you now, let's say it was practical. Let's say that, there was this, beautiful island that said, we're going to accept everyone, enjoy our sandy beaches. So imagine it was practical. You could physically do that. Would you still be against it on purely moral grounds? Or would you say, since it's can be done, let's do that?
No, it wouldn't. It still wouldn't be practical because you need the amount of violence that it would take to get the Arabs to leave. It doesn't matter if they're able to go to a beautiful island in the middle of nowhere. It's like what you said and like what Kahane properly identified. Kahane moved to Israel in 1971. And the first thing he did was create a registry of Arabs who voluntarily, with monetary compensation, in his hypothetical survey, the state of Israel would give the Arabs monetary compensation to leave the state of Israel. And within a year, he abandoned this idea. He abandoned this idea of presenting this list to the government. Why? Because hardly anybody signed up for it. Hardly anybody heard about it. Hardly anybody said yes to it in the people who he was able to contact. And he quickly switched to the talking point of expelling people by force. So it's still not a practical issue because they are not going to leave. They're not going to leave. At most, I think from the West Bank, you could probably expect what? 100,000 people, and from Gaza, maybe 200,000 people. But again, and I can't belabor this, and I can't, that's a hypothesis, but it's an educated guess, which is what a hypothesis is, but it's empirical. It's what Jabotinsky, it's what right-wing Zionists have been identifying forever, that they are attached to this land, that they believe that they have the exclusive superior right to this land, and all they have to do is wait out the Jews.
But
and
they have
then to employ military force.
They have fled from Israel. Like it has
to
happened.
Gaza. Well, wait, they fled from Israel. So like I said, in 1948, it was pretty evenly divided into thirds of people who left because of fear of violence, believing that they would be able to return home. People who left because Arab leaders told them that if they left now to avoid the fighting, then they would be able to return home once the Arab League destroyed Israel. And the people who were expelled. Okay. So the people who were expelled then, like actually expelled by force, is what, 200,000 people? And even that was a huge military ordeal for Israel that it very nearly did not survive from. So just practically employing the IDF right now to remove that many people from their homes is not practical. Again, it would tear apart Israeli society. And from a military perspective, we're basically been fighting on how many different fronts? I mean, every city in the West Bank would turn into a front. What are you going to do? You're going to go into Jenin with bulldozers and tell people to leave? Let's see how that goes for us. Let's see how that goes for us. It's not going to go. It's not going to go swimmingly. I mean, you just said that they don't want to leave. You just... Would I tear Israel apart if we pursued such a policy?
Yes.
I mean, I don't think myself, I am not capable of tearing Israel apart, but I would definitely be a part of an opposition that was against such a policy.
okay, you can protest, you can demonstrate, you can vote against it, like all the democratic tools in your disposal, but you wouldn't like go to civil war. You wouldn't burn a police
We almost
station,
went
right?
we almost went to civil war over the presence of people praying in Dizengoff Square. You think that evicting hundreds of thousands of people from the West Bank is not going to lead? I mean, I say that, you know, kind of tritely and with some humor, but what I mean is that
Yeah.
before 2023, there were people talking about civil conflict in Israel over constitutional reform, not constitutional,
I think a lot
over
has
judicial
changed since
reform.
October 7. I think a lot of people woke up since October 7, realized that what we've been doing until now hasn't worked. And by the way, the settlement project was started by the left, not the right. It was started by Golda Meir. So
That's not true. That's not true. The settlement, Golda Meir became prime minister in 1969, and yes, she, truthfully, she decided not to decide. But the settlement project in earnest started with Menachem Begin's government in 1977, and
but
accelerated in the
people
80s.
moved during her time.
Absolutely,
Like,
but the main flashpoint was the Hebron, was people moving into Hebron, and
So-
the question was whether or not it is moral or even legal to remove Jews from this area who just want to live in the city of their forefathers. But the settlement project, to compare the settlement project in the late 60s and early 70s when Golda Meir was prime minister, I know a lot about her.
I know that's why I mentioned her.
Yeah. It's apples and oranges. There was a couple hundred Jews living in the West Bank then. There's something of 650,000 Jews living in the West Bank today.
Exactly that's exactly the issue. This indecision which you refer to, which started with her and honestly continued with the right-wing governments. This indecision, this inability to decide what we want, has characterized Israel since her time. At no point did we say, okay, this is the way we're going to win this war. This is our destination. Every single action which Israel took the opposite action. You say Israel settled the West Bank? Yes, but Israel didn't expel the hostile population. So you do an action, you do the action which cancels it. Israel starts this big military operation in Gaza, but Israel continues to support Gaza. Every single action which Israel does the exact opposite action. And
I agree with you. I don't think that expelling the population is the exact opposite action, but I agree with you that Israel doesn't know its war aims. It doesn't know what it wants. I completely agree with you on that front. My biggest arguments in this discussion are the practicality arguments and the morality arguments. And even if you believe that it is morally sound to remove a hostile population, in theory and in practice are two very different things. In theory, we can talk about, oh, well, you know, other countries have done this. In practice, it involves sending militants into the West Bank and Gaza, and because the whole point of this conversation is, was Kahane right or wrong, going into Arab cities and towns and mixed cities and towns and forcing loyal citizens of the state of Israel to leave the state of Israel. And that is only going to lead to violence. And by the way, there's about a 50-50.
Two separate issues.
They're not two separate issues. When the contention of the conversation is, was Kahane right or wrong? Again, I'll repeat, he made no difference. He made no difference. And that's what I was prepared to discuss today, that he made no difference. And when faced with that task, the population between the river and the sea is 50-50, is 50% Jews and 50% Arabs. That is 50% of the population having the responsibility of violently expelling the remaining half of the population. It's not going to work. Again, back to the practical aspects of it.
It has happened before.
It didn't happen. When did it happen before?
For example, Bhutan, just in the 90s, they expelled about 1/6 of the population. I forgot what was the name of this
That's
nation.
not one half. That's not even close to one half. What you're talking about is expelling one half of the entire population between the river and the sea. And also, what makes you think that Israel is so safe without these people at our borders? You know, an Arab-Israeli citizen recently traveled back to Israel, I believe it was yesterday, and murdered a 70-year-old Arab Israeli. He left Israel but was further radicalized against Israel while he was away. So what's to say that Israel doesn't have more war imposed on it once we try to undergo this hypothetical mission? I mean, just because they're not next door, that doesn't seem really logical to me. We can still be threatened in a myriad of other ways, not to mention the almost certain international condemnation and sanctions that will befall us in that regard.
So you raised here two very good points, and I want to address both of them. So first of all, as I said, first of all, about the sanctions, right now we have a government in the United States which endorses it. So like in the next 4 years, yes, I'm sure people in Europe will be unhappy about it. I'm sure
the government doesn't endorse it. Steve Witkoff has done everything in his power over the last couple of weeks to walk back Trump's statement. He actually just made a statement saying that
Trump
he does not.
Did make
he
this,
does
statement.
Yeah, because Trump makes a lot of statements. He says a lot of stupid things.
So let's use it.
But the administration has spent the last couple of weeks walking back, saying yes, that Trump wants to, create his, beachfront with, who knows how many failed hotels. But they do not want any mass exodus of people from Gaza. That's been made clear by Steve Witkoff and by officials in the administration.
But he is not the president. In any case, that's the first. The second thing you said about the borders, and in this regard, I completely agree with you. There's this idea that peace is the natural state of mankind, and war is something which disrupts it. In reality, it's the opposite. War is the natural state of kind, and peace is something which disrupts it. So, am I saying that if you free Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, will it bring absolute peace? No, it won't, because nothing can bring absolute peace, especially if you are surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who don't want you to be there. So that point which you raised here is a valid point, and I want to address it. I think that if you do something which is, as you said, it is an extreme action, it is something which is very harsh, they will start treating you differently. They will be less inclined to go to war. Also, there will be less what to fight over, because right now they say, you are oppressing our brothers. There are people in your territory, in your international territory, whom you are oppressing, whom you are treating poorly, and we are fighting for the sake of these people. That is how the war of 1948, that was their reason to start the war. I'm not saying it was true, I'm just saying that is how they justified it. And if you remove that population, then what will they fight for? It will be more and more difficult with each passing year for them to justify this war, because oh my God, these Jews are Majnun, they're crazy, they're very dangerous, they've done this insane thing. And second, they will just invade the country. They will hit a wall. It's the idea of the iron wall, which Jabotinsky wrote about. Which again, I don't fully agree with Jabotinsky, but that was his idea, to have an actual wall, to have an actual border. Because right now, for example, if you go along the border with Jordan, that is not a real border. It's a fence that a goat can kick down. Every time I look in the direction of Jordan, I don't understand why there hasn't been another 7 October from there. I guess these guys are just lazy. That is the only reason there's been no invasion from there. So if you do that, you pull the rug from beneath your enemy to some degree. So it won't be a perfect solution. Nothing is a perfect solution, but I think it will greatly improve our positions, both internationally and geographically. So that is my pragmatic view.
I mean, you say internationally, and I just want to stress that, America does have presidential elections every 4 years. And right now, the conservative movement in America, I believe, is the predictable backlash to the liberal sort of domination of the culture. And what I mean to say is that in 4 years, that pendulum is going to swing back. And it is of the utmost importance that Israel remain in the corner of the free world and democracies. And this action would irreparably remove us from that corner of the world.
Maybe it will inspire them.
I do not want Israel to be Myanmar. I do not want Israel to be Bhutan. I do not want Israel to be Russia in the 19th century. Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people know better than anybody that democracy, liberal democracy, are the best ways to run a country, because those are the conditions in which we are the safest, and we have learned from history
But
that
how
that
does
system
it
protects us the
contradict,
best.
democracy? How
It
does
absolutely contradicts democracy. It is against international law and is against every convention of democracy to remove civilians from occupied territory, to expel
Why?
civilians from occupied territory.
Athens
Why?
was certainly
Because
democracy, but they have done it all the time.
So let me ask you a question. Do you think it was reasonable or legitimate for the Arab world in 1948 to purge every Jew from its midst and expel them to Israel? Iraq, Algeria, Morocco, Syria, all of these places, when Israel was established, they forced out their Jewish communities. And if you ask Arab people, they say, well, it's only natural. Israel kicked out, X amount of number of Arabs, so we had every right to do the same to Jews. Is that what you're arguing for? That, population transfers just happen and we have to just all move on?
I would argue
every November we celebrate, Mizrahi Refugee Day and how the terrible tragedy that befell the Jewish communities in the Middle East.
Yeah.
We don't celebrate, observe it, but we celebrate Mizrahi culture during that day, and we talk about the terrible tragedy that befell the Jewish communities in the Middle East. So, was that okay? Like, is that legally, politically sound?
I think there is a certain fallacy here, because like, if you take a person and lock him in your basement, you have done an evil thing. But if you take a criminal and lock him in a prison, you have done a good thing. So an action is not in and of itself moral. Depends on who do you apply this action to and why. So I believe there is good and there is evil. I believe we are facing evil, and it is justified to use force to defeat evil, just like it is justified to put a criminal in prison. It is not justified to put a random person in prison. So
the Arabs in 1948 would have absolutely the Arabs in 1948 would have absolutely used the same analogy. They would have said Israel is evil. Israel has done a terrible thing into our people, and the Jews are a fifth column in our society that are going to always support Israel and undermine. But they weren't. But right. But it's subjective. Good and evil is subjective. It is subjective. It absolutely.
Jews for example, in Syria, didn't go into the streets and slaughter 1,200 Syrians. There weren't like constant Jewish terrorism in Arab countries. And
Arab and Muslim
weren't
people
a force at all.
Jews weren't a force at all. But what I'm saying is, you cannot make the argument that population transfer is normal and it is often a moral thing to avoid genocide and conflict, and then start saying, oh, well, this one was okay, but this one wasn't, because, this is good and this is evil. It's
we are
either
good and they're evil.
We are good and they're evil. So every Palestinian that you could expel, that you would wish to expel in the West Bank and Gaza, and if we're going to Kahane's ideology, is evil. Is evil then?
Absolutely.
Is evil. Absolutely. Okay. So you're comfortable saying that
again,
every Palestinian in Gaza deserves to...
Mm-hmm. The Allies expelled, I think, around 12 million ethnic Germans from Yugoslavia, from Czechoslovakia, from the Netherlands, from regions which later became Russia. So it's not something which is only done by dark regimes. It's something which is also done by the brightest nations in the world, by the United Kingdom, by the United States. Like basically everyone except us has used this method.
The difference is that those people, again, the morality and practical arguments, those people, the ethnic Germans in Yugoslavia, in the Czech Republic, wherever, it did not take the Czech military to violently expel these people who were engaged in a national... But it did not take a massive military effort, because the Germans were not fighting for self-determination in the Czech Republic. The Germans were not fighting for self-determination in Yugoslavia.
That's how the war started. They invaded Czechoslovakia because they claimed the Sudetenland was part of Germany.
They did not, but these German populations did not demand that the German Reich, after the war had been over, be established in those lands. And again, I mean, we could talk about this all day. We're going back and forth.
Millions of them. The Allies
Right,
killed millions of them. They just devastated their country.
Because the Allies won the war, but Israel has won the war now.
So let's also win the war.
Israel, but it is apples and oranges. Look, we can go through the entirety of history and talk about, will this population transfer, will that population transfer? Israel-Palestine is a singular example. Israel-Palestine is a singular issue of two different nationalities who claim the same land. And the question on the table is coexistence between the two of them impossible? And you only have to spend a day in Israel proper, to realize that it's not. I would argue that the only reason why coexistence has seemed impossible, and I believe is impossible, in the West Bank, and the reason why Israel deemed that coexistence between Jews and Arabs was impossible in Gaza, is because we forget that before 2005, the number of terror attacks that were committed against Jewish civilians in the Gaza Strip made that the only logical conclusion, that Jews cannot continue to live here because it is simply too dangerous and it is a waste of IDF resources to keep this tiny population of Gush Katif surrounded by people who want to murder them. Okay? From 2005, when we evicted Israeli settlers in Gaza, to 2020, there were three models of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay? There was the model in Gaza in which we had removed the soldiers and the civilians, and it was a disaster for us, okay? Because we got rockets every year, terrorism culminating in October 7th. The second model was the central and southern West Bank of both the military, the IDF, and also Israeli civilians. And it has been a disaster for us. Why? Because it's a tiny population of Jews, couple 100,000, living amongst a population that overwhelmingly sympathize with Hamas and want to commit violence, okay? Then you had a model in the northern West Bank, okay, where from 2005, when we evicted settlers from the northern West Bank, along with the settlers from Gaza, you have the civilians who leave and the military that stays, okay? And from 2005 to 2020, the area around Jenin, the northern West Bank, was the most peaceful area of the entire conflict. It was the quietest sector of the entire conflict. In 2020, a seminary, which was always just a settlement, is allowed to return in Chomesh. And terror explodes from Jenin, and terrorists kill people from Jenin. Terrorists from Jenin kill people in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Tel Aviv. And the settlement movement, the settlement project, did everything in their power to make sure that people didn't realize these three models, okay? They said that coexistence is impossible in the West Bank. No, it's not. It's not. We had a solution that worked from 2005 to 2020. The military stayed in order to root out terror, in order to prosecute and go into cities where Palestinians were plotting attacks. Okay, but there were no civilians. There were no civilian Israelis. And so
Ramallah lynch happened in the period which you described. Two people just drove into Ramallah and
that was during the second Intifada. I believe that was 2001. I'm talking about 2005 to 2020. And Ramallah is not the northern West Bank. Ramallah is the center of the West Bank. I'm talking about the northern West Bank, the areas around Jenin.
Do you think you can safely drive into some Jenin, some neighborhood in Jenin now, or in Ramallah? Because
since 2020, there is a renewed Israeli civilian presence around Jenin, and it has resulted in the explosion of terror. I think today there was a terrorist who was shot outside of Chomesh by IDF soldiers. I think that happened just a few hours ago. And I think from 2020, I think the majority of Palestinian terrorists have been from that area, from Jenin. That was not the case. From 2005 to 2020, there was no terror coming from Jenin. The IDF had freedom of movement, had freedom of operation. We went into Jenin, took out the people we needed to take out, and it didn't spill over into violence against our people.
One second, but you want to just keep this game of cat and mouse forever? You want to oppress those people forever? Because it is a game of cat and mouse. You go, you chase them, they shoot at you shoot at them. Maybe you kill a few terrorists, maybe they kill one of your soldiers, and until we reach a political solution.
And if that takes 5 years, if that takes 20 years, if that takes 50 years, fine.
But-
That's infinite. That's more practical to me than forcibly removing millions of people from a territory.
All this time, Jews are being murdered. That is the cost, not time.
No,
not
the
money.
whole point is
Jewish
that
lives.
Jews are not being murdered. The whole point is that Jews are not being murdered. There were no Jewish civilians murdered in the northern West Bank around Jenin from 2005 to 2020 because there were no Jewish civilians there.
But there were Jews who were murdered. Like, there wasn't a single year in Israeli history in which not a single Jew was murdered by Arabs.
Of course, but what I'm saying is from 2005 to 2020, we had a model of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was far less violent and far easier to manage because we had our military doing what our military needs to do, rooting out terror, rooting out
Imagine
extremism.
how much easier it would be if there would be no Arabs at all in this region. If they were only
why
on the other side
would
of the
you
border.
need to go through the moral and practical quandary of expelling millions of people if we have evidence of a way in which our two societies can live together? Why would you need to do that? But they can. We have evidence that we have empirical evidence that they can. One, in Israel itself, the cooperation between Israelis and Jews, Jews and Arabs in Israel. That is the model that's empirically proven every day. And then we have the model of the West Bank, where we know that the presence of soldiers, but not civilians, leads to a dramatic reduction in terror and violence until a political solution is made. That is the evidence that we have.
It is still war. You're still fighting them because they were in a weakened position. You struck them very strongly during how you call it, the operation which Sharon had, Shomer Chomot. I think you destabilized them.
Operation
So they don't have infinite resources. They're human beings. They're not zombies. They're people like you and me. They can't.
If you think the war,
they need to take breaks.
If you think the war won't continue after a hypothetical expulsion of millions of Palestinians, if you think that is also not a recipe for prolonged conflict, then
I think certainly not internal war. You won't have an internal enemies. And yes, I think it will show people Israel is a serious player, and it will also pull the rug from the reason why they have to fight, because they will no longer have Palestinians to save from the nasty Zionists.
What happens
they will still
when
want
you
to reclaim
move?
this land.
They still want to reclaim this land, absolutely. And at the end of the day, at the end of the day, we are 6-7 million Jews surrounded by hundreds of millions of Arabs and 1 billion Muslims. A population transfer from 100 kilometers away to 200 kilometers away has no upsides. It will bring international condemnation, it will tear apart Israeli society, and it won't bring us security. Because again, it's a couple hundred kilometers away. You think the war will end? It's not going to end. They believe intrinsically that they just have to wait us out. And I don't see how that becomes any less likely. Also, you mentioned that you weren't going to bring any religious arguments into this, but we have to say that there is a very strong religious undertone to obviously the pro-Kahane argument, but obviously the argument of population transfer point blank, because it stems from the idea that the West Bank is ours. And of course, one can make the argument that the West Bank is ours politically, legally, but the strongest current, I believe, in Israeli society that demands the West Bank is the religious current, saying that this is God's land and that we need to settle it in order to redeem ourselves. And I will say, exactly. And every time that religion informs state policy, every time a religion informs state policy to the point of where extreme policies are written in the name of it, the state collapses. Period. You can take a look around the Middle East and see that for yourself.
I'm not okay. The world isn't limited to the Middle East, but the reason why I didn't bring the religious argument, because it is rooted in faith, in belief, and it is not something which you can argue. It's like I told you, you have to like artichokes, and you tell me I don't like artichokes. We can't really argue about it. So yeah, I can bring like quotes from the Bible, I can bring commentaries, but I don't think it will be very interesting because you can say, I don't believe in those things, and it's okay. That is why I brought the pragmatic arguments. But you said will tear Israeli society apart, and actually, I want to quote an American trade union activist, a guy named Nicholas Klein. He said, I think it was somewhere around World War I. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, and then they attack you and want to burn you, and finally they build monuments to you. So when I was growing up in Israel, just mentioning Kahane made you dangerous radical. Like you would get left out of the room. That would make you sound like, you could as well say, I'm going to summon Cthulhu. It was that insane. And then, you became part of the discourse. And now we're having this debate. We're not fighting, we're having a debate, which is great. So the more time passes, the more these ideas become mainstream, the more they become tenable. And now we hear that from the White House. You say that Trump didn't mean it. I don't know, but he did say it. It's part of the discourse. So it's something which is legitimate to debate. So obviously the tendency in the Israeli public is to move towards those ideas as more and more other ideas don't bring any satisfying solution. And honestly, something which we have never tried. We don't know what will happen because we didn't try it yet.
I will just say that Yair Golan's Hademokratim, the merger between labor and merits, is currently destroying both Otzma Yehudit and religious Zionism in the polls right now. So to say that Israeli society has shifted, sure, but in which direction we'll find out. And if the polls can be believed, there's actually going to be a stronger showing for the left in the next election.
So,
by the way, the left did actually do a transfer as opposed to the right. So the left is better in that.
So
the left.
We've hit our mark. I'm conscious of your time, so happy to go over. I would like to open up the questions from the audience if you're both up for that. But I do appreciate we've hit the hour mark, and you may not have time. It's getting late in Israel, so I just put it to you guys. Do you want to go to closing statements now, or would you like to open the floor to questions from the audience?
We can, whatever's expedient, I guess. Whatever you prefer to come first.
Let's do some questions, and I'll go first because I'm here. So Uri, I've got a question for you, and I've got a couple of questions for Blake. Uri, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is the questions of conscience that Blake was talking about. If push came to shove, would you be willing to be the person that physically removed those families that you're talking about? So you got to. Oh, wow, he didn't like that question. Okay, I'm sure he's going to be back. I'm sure my question wasn't that bit. So while we wait, Blake, I'll move a question over to you. And I guess I've been aware of your thoughts for a long time, long before October the 7th. And I've seen a huge shift in the discourse on my platforms. And
I apologize. I was disconnected for like 10 seconds.
That's
so
fine.
Maybe I missed.
Yeah, okay. I'll go back to your question, Uri, then I'll come to you, Blake. So, Uri, I just thought you ran for my question. I thought it was so fierce that you...
No, goodness, no. The internet just stopped working for a short while.
Your internet connection was smoked. You're not supposed to answer this question. Yeah. But no, my question was very simple. It was, would you be the person that would be willing to remove a young family, babies, elderly people from a village in, let's say, the northern West Bank, or from Khan Yunis, or from any of these areas? Would you be willing to do it yourself, or would you have to send other people to do that task?
First of all, I'm lazy. I'd rather people do anything instead of me.
Morally,
so
you know, would you morally be okay removing?
It's like you're like I don't want to do the dishes right now. If someone came over and did the dishes for me, I'd be thrilled. So first of all, would I rather someone else did it? Of course, because I'd rather someone else did almost anything I do. Would I agree to do that? Yes. I can say that my grandfather actually took part in something similar. It's not something which I'm proud of or ashamed of, but it is a fact. And it was called, I think, Operation Chichivitsa. It's when the Red Army removed the population of the Caucasus after World War II to Kazakhstan. And so they expelled, I think, about 1.5 million people. It's not something which I say was right. It's not something which I'm proud of. I'm just saying that, again, it's not something unprecedented. It's not something so commonplace that people don't even talk about it. And my grandfather was the kindest, nicest person I knew. And yet he took part in something like that. So I don't think it's something so extreme. I don't think it's really that different from, a police operation. And honestly, it's not going to be like in the movies when people run into houses and you have to leave.
That's exactly what it's going to be like.
People, if you push, well, it's not what happened in Gaza. It's not what happened in Gaza. In Gaza, you told people to go and they left. So I have a fact to counter
into Gaza.
And these people will move into Jordan. It's another Arab territory. You didn't need soldiers to hold people by the head and drag them out. You just said, Avichai Adri says, he's the voice of God. Avichai Adri says, go to point so and so, and people do that.
Okay, and so Blake, first thing one thing that struck me as quite interesting with what you were saying was it was almost the inverse of what Uri was saying, and I know it's on a different scale, but you mentioned that the only time there's really been peace was when a territory was made free of Jews rather than free of Arabs, which I thought was quite an interesting comparison. And so Uri's saying we need to get rid of the Arabs because that will bring peace. And you're saying, no, the only time we got peace was when we moved the Jews.
Getting rid of the Jews will also bring peace. It's not the peace of I want.
Yeah, but it's I know it's very different scales of population. I guess my question for you isn't that. I just thought it was an interesting thing that you brought up. I guess my question for you is, I've been aware, as I was saying, of your views for a long time. I've followed a lot of your activity online. I haven't bought the book yet, but I will, and I recommend everybody else does as well. And my question is, I've seen a huge shift in my audience to the right. I've never seen so many people calling for population transfers, etc. And in terms of the solution, in terms of bringing peace to this region or stability in absence of peace, what's changed for you since October 7th? So obviously transfers not on the cards for you, it's off the table. But what's changed?
I believe very strongly that everything that I was worried about in the months leading up to October 7th was vindicated on October 7th. That the religious right in Israel is the most dangerous anti-Zionist force that we are dealing with right now, and that their policies will render Israel not a democracy and therefore not able to survive. When you have a situation where it's not just an occupation, because occupation is legal under international law. We have every right to occupy the West Bank. We know that the second we remove our soldiers from the West Bank, that territory will be used to attack Israel. And there is no morality in that. There's no morality in me waking up tomorrow morning upon the Israeli eviction from the West Bank and having hundreds of missiles pointed at my apartment, just a couple 100 kilometers away, or even less than that. There's no morality in that. But a regime that moves its civilians into occupied territory and imposes two different systems of law on that territory based on who is Jewish Israeli and who is not, is security suicide. And we saw that happen on October 7th. And like I mentioned before, the most fundamental question to ask about October 7th is, where were our soldiers? And once you answer the question of where our soldiers were, you get a pretty good indication of what Israeli policy looked like before that terrible day. And that Israeli policy has been driven by a religious messianism that is antithetical to what I believe everything Zionism stands for, which was a rebellion against traditional Jewish theology, that we have to follow the law and appease supernatural elements in order to be liberated. We are our own liberators, and liberation comes in the form of sovereignty and self-determination, meaning a Jewish majority state in defensible borders, not borders that cannot be defined, not borders that, you know, go in this direction somewhere and then there's a checkpoint and go in another direction somewhere, but like Jabotinsky said, an iron wall with an unshakable Jewish majority on the inside. And that is the definition of Zionism, because in that system, a democracy can flourish, and the religious right in Israel is doing everything in its power to undo that system and to undo Zionism.
One question to follow up with what you just said, but before I do, if anyone wants to guarantee a question, head over to YouTube, because it's the only place I can read the chat. I know there's I think 1,500 watching on Twitter. Comment on YouTube, because I'm not watching Twitter. And if you want to guarantee a question, do a super chat, because I'm definitely going to read those. But I guess my follow-up question is, and it's just, it's very interesting to hear your perspective on, obviously I know you would blame Hamas for October the 7th, but from the Israeli side, you see the religious right as being a cause to October the 7th. If I'm understanding what you're saying, I think a strong counter argument from the right would be the reason there wasn't an October the 7th from the West Bank was because there was such a strong military presence there. And there was such a strong military presence there because there were civilians there. What do you say to that? Like, do you believe that such a strong military presence in the West Bank did avert October the 7th and the kind of buildup of arms and military and infrastructure that we saw in Gaza?
So you're asking, sorry, could you rephrase the question? So
yeah, you seem to be saying, and forgive me if I misunderstood, that the soldiers weren't on the border because they were protecting civilians in the West Bank, and that left Israel more vulnerable. But there's a counter argument that would come from the right that would be the reason that you didn't have 500 kilometers of tunnels, heavily armed militias in the West Bank to the same extent that we have in Gaza, was because there was such a strong military presence in the West Bank, and there was such a strong military presence there because of the settlers.
No, the military does not need settlements. It is a fallacy. It is Israeli orthodoxy to believe that. But if you listen to multiple generals, multiple chiefs of staff, multiple heads of Mossad and the Shin Bet, the settlements help the army, but they are not necessary in order to maintain security control over the West Bank. Why? Because you can have, like, let's say, like a huge army base in the West Bank without having it be a neighborhood with civilians there. You don't need homes with civilians there. I recently went to a huge army base outside of Ramallah. It's like this big headquarters of Kogat. That's part of a legal occupation. We have every right to be there. We know that this land will be used against us if we pull out of it. But does there need to be neighborhoods miles long cutting into the West Bank, which have the sole intention of preventing any sort of continuity of an Arab entity in the West Bank? Those do not need to be there. Those do not need to be there. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to stress this, I'm not saying that Israel is going to or should evacuate places like Gush Etzion, or places like the majority of Ariel, or the settlements surrounding Jerusalem even. But what we've created in the West Bank is a maze of sovereignty, is what I like to call it, is a maze of sovereignty with people living well outside of Israel's sovereign borders. And that is untenable because it puts an enormous strain and it is an enormous burden on our military and our capability to defend ourselves. And yes, I fully believe that that is, of course, the blame for Hamas, the blame for October 7th, and any harm that befalls innocent Jews and innocent Israelis, Arab and Jewish, because again, Arabs were killed on October 7th, is the fault of, it is the people who committed the attack are wholly responsible. But like I said, after 1973, the Yom Kippur War, of course, Egypt and Syria were responsible for waging war against Israel and killing all of our soldiers and invading our territory. But we evicted Golda Meir out of the office of prime minister. That's what Israelis do. Why? Because we're a democratic society that hold our leaders accountable when they pursue failed policy. And how we cannot look at October 7th and say what leadership decisions and positions have led to this moment bewilders me. And I think it's very dangerous going forward because we're going to just repeat the same policies.
So I'm looking for questions, and all the questions are quite insulting. Here we go. So I'm going to show the questions. So what does Blake think of evacuating Gaza in 2005?
Our soldiers should have stayed, and Israel should have had freedom of action militarily in the Gaza Strip, but our civilians should have left.
So I think it wasn't a question, but I did read it in the comments. Someone, I'm going to misquote that because I missed the comment now. But someone said something to the effect of, so is what you're advocating for a military occupation over civilian? And in which case, how long does that go on for? Is it indefinitely? You have soldiers in a territory which I would assume you would be say at some point could become a Palestinian state. If so, up until that point, you have soldiers there.
Doesn't need. I don't agree necessarily that the solution is up until it becomes a Palestinian state, like Uri said, in which I would say Bezrat Hashem, even me, would say that is, let's say the Hashemite kingdom, which has no business governing the state of Jordan, the country of Jordan. It's completely an arbitrarily European decision. Let's say the Hashemite family falls and Jordan collapses. It would be great for the Palestinians in the West Bank to receive Jordanian citizenship and to become citizens of Jordan. And then no one has to move anywhere because the Israelis who are living in the West Bank can stay where they are as Israeli citizens. And the Palestinians living in the West Bank would become Jordanian citizens, which most of Jordan's population is already Palestinian. So that would be my ideal situation. People say that's not really going to happen because of, the Hashemite kingdom has all these alliances and relationships. But what I'm saying is that the ideal result for me isn't necessarily a Palestinian state. It's just a situation where there is, we have a Jewish democratic state, meaning that the people who have Israeli citizenship, there is a overwhelming Jewish majority, a stable Jewish majority, and people are not denied rights based on their ethnicity.
So I need some questions for Uri because I've just got this comment. So audience, to start asking Uri some questions. Can we please hear more Uri? It's Blake all the time, or all Blake all the time. So hopefully some people can fire some questions over. Quick question for you then. Sorry, Uri, Blake again, just because it's based on what you said. You said Gush Etzion you could see as being part of Israel in whatever negotiations take place. Why?
Because it's too big. Like it's too big. That's not, like I say, it's not reasonable. It's not practical or reasonable to remove Jews from huge cities and towns in the West Bank, just like it's not reasonable to remove Palestinians from Ramallah and Jenin.
And so if the settlements were to grow and you saw larger settlements in the north, would your position then change because it's just purely based on the demographics? If there are more Jews living here, it then becomes less reasonable to remove them.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. I don't see that. I think that's a hypothetical. I don't see all of a sudden like a city popping up around Jenin that's just a Jewish settlement.
Maybe
You
not
know.
Jenin, but the populations within settlements are continuously growing.
Right, but Jews right now represent, I think, 5 or 6% of the population of the West Bank.
No,
Like, let's say it's
5 million Jews.
Yeah, it's like 600,000. Oh, no, I'm sorry. In the areas outside of Jerusalem, once you leave the sort of radius of Jerusalem, you know, like from Jerusalem to from like Gush Etzion to Ramallah, once you leave that area, I think like Jews are like 5% of the population.
Okay.
Yeah. So because the majority of Jews who live in the West Bank, I think the vast majority of Jews who live in the West Bank are in that zone, like in between, you know, in East Jerusalem and on the outskirts of Ramallah.
Perfect. We have a question for Uri, which is about Kahane, which is good. So what does Uri think of Kahane's misogynist tendencies? And I'll actually throw in another thing, because we kind of touched on that. Throw in theocracy as well, because that's all part of the vision of the state of Israel, would be the religious aspects of, well, he didn't shy away from religion. So misogyny and then theocracy.
Okay, so that's a lot. First of all, I want to say that interestingly, what Blake said earlier is practically a quote of something that Kahane said. He said the murder of every Jew has 2 accomplices: the Arab who murdered him and the government that made sure he will be murdered. So in this regard, that is the exact same position as you said about who is guilty and who is responsible. So that's interesting, because that is the same way of looking at things. And I absolutely think that this government should be taken to task. I think it's outrageous these people didn't resign. I think it's outrageous that any of these generals didn't resign after October 7th. They should have all been, should have all resigned and been, on Twitter writing essays that no one reads. These people have no business leading to anyone. And yeah, and like I come from the right, you come from the left, but we both say that those people should go. I'm not defending those people, just something which I wanted to address. They have failed, and I disagree with the reason why they have failed, but the point is they have failed, and that is absolutely. And I don't think next October 7 will come from the direction of the West Bank. I think it will come from the direction of Jordan, simply because the border is so bad. But okay, I want to address the actual question. I think this person didn't listen to the start of the conversation, because you can see I'm not religious. I have huge respect for the Bible. I have huge respect for our history, our culture. Who doesn't like to hear the occasional blessing? But I wouldn't describe myself as a religious person. But again, that is a spectrum. Everything is a spectrum. So no person is like an absolutely religious Jew. No one has all the mitzvot. You can't do all the mitzvot for the very basic reason, because some of them are for men, some of them for women. So you can't do all of the mitzvot. No one's 100% religious, 100% tzaddik. And on the other hand, you don't have anyone who has broken all the mitzvot. No one is that irreligious. So it's always a spectrum. So at the start of the conversation, I said that Kahane, when people say Kahane was right, 99% of the people who say it had never read anything he wrote, had never watched any of his interviews. When they say Kahane was right, they speak specifically about population transfer. And that is also what I think we came to discuss here. So his social views, his religious views, I think it's outside the scope of this conversation. And I don't feel
It shouldn't
obliged,
be, though. It shouldn't be outside the scope of
them,
this conversation.
Because let's take even like the worst person I can think of. Hitler. Absolutely, we're against him. We think he is probably the single worst person in history, that at least in the context of the Jewish people. But if you go over everything he ever said, I'm sure you will find something that you agree with, like animal rights, or he was against boiling lobsters alive. And if you find like the best person you can think of, if you like, I don't know, Joseph, your namesake, I'm sure you'll find something which he did, which wasn't perfect, which was, petty or mean. So I don't think you have to take to take it all. You can say, okay, in that regard, that was good, that is bad. No, take the good. Because again, like earlier I spoke about the Soviet Union, which was a terrible country. I'm absolutely against it, but some of the things they did, we could learn from them. So that is why I don't feel obliged to address every single view Kahane ever experienced. Personally, I'm far more liberal than he was in regards to social issues. I'm not misogynistic, I'm not homophobic, I don't think I'm racist. So I don't think this is within the context of this conversation.
Okay, no, I think that's a fair pushback. And yeah, I'm sure you're much more liberal than Kahane. Maybe not as liberal as Blake, but it's a spectrum. And so
Yeah.
We do have a question for you here, Uri, which is a question to Uri. What's a practical way to resettle the Arabs in Judea and Samaria if they are not hostile? And then follow-on question from the same person, is it right to resettle Arabs if they're not hostile? And then I'll add a third one into that. How do you determine if someone is hostile or not? How do you see into their mind?
First of all, when two nations are at war, every single member of the other nation is hostile by definition. If you go back to World War II, did every single Japanese participate in the war against the United States? Of course not. Did half? Also not. 20%? Also not. For the very reason most of the war took place at sea. How many Japanese actually served in the Navy? Certainly not tens of millions. Nevertheless, the United States completely destroyed Tokyo in a massive firebombing. They dropped nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. They dropped the nuclear bomb in Nagasaki. And I think that not only it was morally right, it was a moral obligation. I think it was the most moral thing that could have been done because they did it to save American lives. They did it in order to minimize American casualties. So the very question, like who is individually hostile, who is individually non-hostile, I think is the wrong question to ask. And here I do actually want to quote the Bible. I do want to actually go into a religious direction for a moment. In the book of Numbers, I'm going to read it from the screen because I didn't remember it by heart. It says, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you live. And then I will do to you what I plan to do to them. So every decision you make comes at the cost of our children, our parents, our brothers and sisters. It is not moral to say, okay, maybe this guy is not hostile, so I'll skip him. You have to win the war. So you fight against the population. You'll notice that I almost never say Hamas on Twitter. I never use that word because we're not fighting against a political party. Like if you ask the average person who was the leading political party in Japan during World War II, they won't be able to answer it to you without Googling it. People don't know what was the ruling party in Japan because it doesn't really matter. The war was between the United States and Japan. It wasn't Japan against the Democrat Party. It wasn't the United States against some Japanese party. It was the American people against the Japanese people until the war ended. So when the war ends, absolutely, you have to treat each person as an individual. You have to consider what every single person has done, just like as soon as the war ended, the United States treated the Japanese as individuals. But as long as the war goes on, you cannot afford yourself to do that because you do that at the cost of your people. You do that at the cost of your family. And that cost is too high. So you have to defeat the enemy as a unit.
Okay. And so we got accused of not giving Uri enough airtime and being all about Blake, but we're going to make it about Blake again. So Blake, could you answer this question? Why is it moral to expel Jews from Judea and Samaria, but not Arabs?
I don't want to expel Jews from Judea and Samaria. I just don't want the army there protecting them. And if I had my guess, once the army is no longer there to protect them, a vast, vast majority of Jews who are in Judea and Samaria would return to mainland Israel within a matter of days.
So just to follow up what we were saying before, if the army wasn't there, what would prevent Hamas or one of the other many Palestinian factions from arming to the extent that they did in Gaza? What changes? That's the thing that I'm not clear with what you're saying.
Right. I don't want the army guarding settlements. I do not want the army guarding outposts in the middle of the West Bank. I want the army guarding sovereign Israeli territory, and when necessary, going into places like Ramallah, Jenin, Hebron, and taking out terror cells, which we have shown, and there's evidence for, the Israeli army has every capacity to do without the presence of civilian neighborhoods in cities and towns.
Okay.
Again, you don't need a neighborhood. You just need an army headquarters that is well guarded, and you need sovereign Israeli territory, an iron wall of defense in order to carry out a legal occupation and a legal defense of Israeli sovereignty.
And is it just purely out of pragmatism that you don't see Judea and Samaria as either being part of Israel or needing to be part of Israel?
It's not part of Israel. It's currently not part of Israel. It is occupied territory. Now, if one wants to make the argument that it is legally ours and that is morally and politically ours, I'm very susceptible to that argument. But I'm very open to that argument, and I, in fact, agree with that argument. Sure, it's about the practicality of that argument, and right now it is not annexed. It is not annexed territory. So if Netanyahu tomorrow morning signs a law that says that Israel extends sovereignty over the occupied territories, then yes, the West Bank is a part of Israel, and that's that. But as of now, it is not part of Israel.
So if Netanyahu did do that, sorry to press, if Netanyahu did annex it tomorrow, would your position then change it? And if it does change, then what happens to the coexistence argument that we've literally been discussing for the last hour and a half?
It's going to get a lot worse, because when you have a situation where 3 million people are now living within the state's borders, you have a choice to make. You either give them rights, you either give them political rights in order to retain your status as a democracy, or you don't, and you become a very undemocratic state that starts with an A. So
so if they do, and Israel, let's say, does grant them rights, so it's still a democracy.
We're not a Jewish state anymore. We're not a Jewish state anymore, and that's the end of Zionism, and that's a damn tragedy that I really do not want to happen, because I like a Jewish state, and I'm a Zionist through and through.
So you're not advocating for what Kahane advocated for, but you're not too far from it either, in the sense that you're saying these two communities can't live together. They can't.
Jews and Arabs can live together in a democratic. Jews and Arabs, provided
the Jews are the majority, are you saying? Provided the Jews are
provided the Jews are a majority, because the Jews in a majority will have a democracy, will impose a democracy. There is not a single Arab state in the Middle East that's a democracy right now. So Israel is a democracy. Israel, in its sovereign borders, is a democracy right now. You're not denied rights based on who your mother was. That makes it a democracy. Arabs and Jews can coexist under the conditions of Israel being a Jewish majority state and also democratic. Arabs and Jews will not coexist if Israel is a Jewish state with millions of stateless people in the state who are not Jews, or if everyone is given rights, and sooner rather than later, the idea of a Jewish state is either through force or through the democratic process phased out of existence, because we have every reason to believe that Jews as a minority will not be treated democratically. So we have the formula for how Jews and Arabs can exist in the Middle East, and that is how it is done every day in Israel, Israel proper, meaning everyone is given the same rights, but Jews are in the majority. Yes.
Okay, so another question for you, Blake, and then we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll go to closing comments because it's gone to 1 hour and 40 minutes. But Blake, your solution sounds like the occupation of Lebanon. Why would the outcome here be any different?
In terms of the military presence?
Yeah.
I
assume.
Yeah, in terms of the military presence, we retreated from Lebanon because of international pressure and under the false assumption that Hezbollah would not be able to wage war upon Israel anymore. And also the propping up of organizations like UNIFIL, which were corrupt from the start. And so I think it's a different scenario. I think I'm very bullish, by the way. I'm very passionate about outlawing UNRWA because I do not believe that Arabs and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza can legitimately be classified as refugees. And so I don't think that if we were to occupy the West Bank without the presence of civilians, I don't think that we should make the same mistakes as in Lebanon, where we believe that international efforts to restore peace are going to work. That's going to be our decision to make based on the reality on the ground. I think it's not really easy to compare these situations.
Okay, so I said there'd be 2 more questions. This is one. It's just in order. So Blake, apologies. Well, I'm assuming he's not talking about Uri here, but what part of they want to kill us doesn't this guy understand? Let's assume it's both of you, but I'm assuming, Blake, that's directed at you, but you can both answer that.
I believe that they want. I don't like the blanket statement of they want to kill us. That is who's I agree with Uri, by the way, about the United States wasn't against the fighter pilots of Japan. It was fighting a war against Japan. We are currently at war with the Palestinian people. I completely understand that, and I completely agree with that. However, I don't ascribe to they want to kill us and therefore we have to kill them first. I don't think we should base policy on the Book of Numbers. And I don't think the Jews back then should have done it either, because look how that... It's a great book, but I know a lot of great books, and I'm not about to base my foreign policy off Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So
it's also a good book.
Also a good book. Shouldn't be anywhere near a court of law.
Okay, so... is that a question for me?
Question for you, and then sorry, you didn't answer that. If you want to answer that, they're trying to kill us, but otherwise, we actually have a question for you. Can one fight a religious war? Oh, sorry, I've lost that. Here we go. Can one fight a religious war with secular mindset and disregard the religious overtones of the war that was started on religious grounds?
That is a very interesting question, actually. I think so. Yes, because again, we've already established that religion is a spectrum. No one is completely religious. No one is completely irreligious, and it takes us to the question: what is religion? What does it mean to be religious? I want to expand the issue a little bit. The Hebrew word for religion is dat right now. Dat is not a Semitic word. It's an Indo-European word. It comes from the same word as data. It means something which is given, that which was given. So in this regard, and the Arabs use the word din, law. So you can treat religion as a set of rituals, as some mystical and spiritual beliefs, but it's also a series of axioms of guidelines. And a completely secular person can say that the philosophy, the moral ideology behind the religion is something which we can base our policy on, even if we don't practice the mystical and religious aspects of that. So, for example, if you look at the conflict in Northern Ireland, it was between Catholics and Protestants. But these people weren't very religious. It was it was more, it was a conflict between two groups which came from religious groups, but they weren't very religious. In the same way, there were, strangely enough, suicide bombers during the Intifada, which were sent by Palestinian organizations which were ostensibly socialists. And socialism is not a religious ideology. So you could take these religious ideas, these religious principles, and use them as a guideline for something which people will call more secular. And also, what is religious group? Like the English ruled here for 50 years, the Ottomans ruled here for 500 years. So let's assume the Ottoman influence is deeper than the English influence. And they had the millet system, or millet, I don't know how you pronounce it in English, which basically said that a person's religion is his group. So Armenian was both an ethnic group and a religious group. So they divided people based on groups. And Israel, in many ways, continues this Ottoman approach of you're an Arab Muslim. That is the kind of person that you are. It doesn't describe your individual choices, your individual beliefs, but what kind of person you are. You are, I know, Armenian Christian. That is the kind of person that you are. So in this regard, you can have a religious conflict between completely irreligious people. So that's like my double reply to this question. And that approach is in some ways contradicts the idea of democracy, because the idea of democracy is to treat each person as an absolute individual. But it doesn't necessarily work like that in the Middle East. We did inherit a lot of ideas from the Ottoman Empire, including this one. So I hope this answers the question.
And so I'd now like to go to closing questions, so you can both, closing statements, so you can both log off and enjoy what's left of your evening. I'm happy for either of you to go first. And if neither of you can volunteer, I'll choose one.
I can go first. Look, oh God, I didn't even think of a closing argument. I'm honestly a little bit sleepy, so this might not come across as eloquent as I want it to, or as people are expecting it to. It is late in Israel, but I will say that, you know, since October 7th, there has been a shift to the right. I'm not convinced amongst Israelis themselves, but I think more loudly in the diaspora. And I think that anybody in the diaspora who claims to support Kahane, Meir Kahane, or say that Kahane was right, really doesn't have a leg to stand on. One, because they don't understand the reality of Israel, a place where miraculously Jews and Arabs live together without violence, despite the great efforts of people, both Arabs and Jews, to undo that peace that does exist here. And they also are being incredibly intolerant and racist in thinking that they are somehow doing more for the Jewish nation than Arabs in Israel who have served in the army and who have dedicated a great deal of their lives to being loyal citizens and contributing to the mosaic of Israeli culture. And I also want to say that there is little more dangerous than the idea that Israel doesn't have to be a democracy. You know, you hear that from a lot of people, especially after October 7th. You know, why does Israel have to be a democracy? You know, plenty of states around the world are not democracies, and the one thing that matters is the protection of Jewish life, and that is ultimately the goal of Zionism. And as long as we're protecting Jewish life, then we are fulfilling Zionism. And I just think that that shows a deep misunderstanding as to who the Jewish people are, and what our collective consciousness is. We throughout the last 75 years, through constant war and terrorism and political assassinations and existential threats, internal and external, have remained a representative parliamentary system where people's rights are not violated and where the state acts as best as it can in the realm of international law. That is amazing. And it's simply because we don't have a choice, because we are a people who our national pastime is disagreeing with each other. And the only way to mitigate those disagreements without killing each other is by having a representative body. Israel will never adopt Kahanism without tearing itself apart. Why? Because of, like I said, the morality and the practicality of the praxis of removing Arab Israelis and millions of people who are not Israeli citizens from the West Bank and Gaza, from the land. But also, we didn't even get into this, the social ramifications of a government that is guided first and foremost by religion, which, as I said before, is the antithesis of the founding principle of Zionism, that the fate of the Jewish people was in fact entrusted in the Jewish people themselves and not in God and not in Scripture. And to think that we would succumb to an authoritarian system without destroying ourselves in the process, I think reflects a fundamental misunderstanding as to who the Jewish people are. Maybe not in biblical times, but who we have grown to be over the past 2 millennia. And, it wasn't that long ago when Kahane when Kach was banned from running in the Knesset, and when Kahane gave his speeches to an empty plenary in the Knesset, because members of all parties, right, left, religious and secular, left the room when he was speaking. And the Israelis of those times, of decades ago, also went through many a hard time. They were surrounded by war and terrorism, and things weren't gravy. But they had the sensibility to understand that democracy was worth it, and that tolerance and anti-racism in society was worth it. And it's very sad and very dark that we have lost that by allowing emissaries of that movement to enter our politics, because we are better than our enemies. We are better than our enemies, and it matters that we're better than our enemies, that we are more moral, that we are inclined toward democracy where they are inclined toward theocracy and dictatorship. That matters. It's how we sell ourselves to the rest of the world. And it's how we sleep at night and are able to get up in the morning and carry out our lives in the miracle that is the modern Jewish state. So that's how I'll leave it.
Ori, over to you. Closing comments.
All right, thank you. So I want to address mostly what you said. So you mentioned the Israelis of those times. The Israelis of those times have failed. The solutions they proposed, the methods they exercised, didn't give us the result which we desired. That is why people consider different options now. You mentioned earlier the occupation, which is legal. I agree, it is legal, but towards what purpose? Eternal occupation, like for how? Like I think it was Frederick Douglass who said you can't hold a person down without being down with him. So do we oppress people forever? Do we occupy them forever? That is an alternative. I have heard no other alternative. People always tell us what not to do, what is not right, but no one says what should be done. No one says what is a solution. That is right now the only solution to the conflict which is being offered. That is why more and more people are being drawn to it, because they see no alternative. Rabin did have a suggestion. We tried it and it didn't work. So, and since then, we've only heard what not to do. Now, you spoke about democracy, and democracy is a tool. It's not a regime. Even if you take any republic on the planet right now, they have democratic elements and they have non-democratic elements. For example, you don't elect, in Israel, you don't elect the district attorney, you don't elect the general. So you have many elements which are not democratic. So that's why I also want Israel to be a democratic country. This tool is very beneficial. I want it to be representative. How you call it? Republic. It is a republic, but I don't see why. Like you say, that is democratic. That is not democratic. Democracy is the rule of the people. Republic is it's a public affair. So, like ancient Athens, it was definitely a democracy. No one will dispute that Athens was a democracy. It was the democracy, and they have exercised many cases of population transfer. They have even committed genocides without ceasing being a democracy. So I don't see the contradiction between democracy and those things. And democracy is not a universal tool which you apply to absolutely everything. No one said that the United States was less democratic because they dropped a nuclear bomb on someone. And you said that you don't want the IDF guarding settlements, that you want them to do important things. But suppose like you say you don't want to evacuate or transfer Jews. Okay, but suppose someone did do that. Yeah, I'm gonna. I'm saying in advance that is not a position that you made. I just want to address this position. I don't want to engage in strawman arguments. So suppose that you do like have this border. You still need to defend Jewish communities. They will just be in a different line because, as you said, the enemy considers. As all enemies, as far as they're concerned, there is no difference between Ariel and Tel Aviv. You will always have to guard your towns. The more you pull back, the less you will have to guard. You'll still have to guard them. So right now, as much as this policy is open to critique, everyone else just says what not to do. That is the only position which is positive, which offers something which can be done. We tried other things and they didn't work, and we have only remained with the negatives. So I don't think it's something which is anti-democratic, because if the majority of the public will support it, it will by definition be democratic. And you also mentioned international law. I don't see the connection between democracy and international law. It's for that matter, the international laws were made by people whom no one elected. These bodies are not democratic. They are, honestly, I view them as atavisms, as something which remained from a previous era, which is becoming increasingly less relevant. Like right now, the ICC is being sanctioned by the United States. So obviously, I think these, like every time after a big war, you had some kind of peace. You had the Roman peace, right? You had the peace of Westphalia. Every time, like the world creates some system to govern itself, and this system degrades, and then a new system appears. We're on the cusp of a new system appearing. The old system, the international laws, the UN, that is all breathing its last. It is declining. And I see no value in holding into something which is in decline, which is breathing its last. And I think we should be heading towards diffusion. I think not only the world won't be against, I think the world will be inspired and move more in that correct direction, in that more truly moral direction. So not only I think it will, I don't think it will cause more countries to be against Israel. I think it will inspire Europe, to inspire America to also act against evil in a more decisive manner. It will be an inspiration to the world. I don't think it will isolate us from the world. So, yeah.
Amazing. Okay, thank you both for your time. I think this is actually a testament to Jewish unity. I don't think I could have got two people on a panel whose views were more opposing than the two of you, and you both conducted yourself with class. So I truly appreciate the way this conversation has gone. You've both been very, very strong advocates for your positions, and I think the comments are a testament to that. So thank you both for taking part. Before you go, can you just
thank you for inviting me?
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Before you go, could you tell people where they can find you and where they can buy your books?
Yes, you can find me at Blake Flayton anywhere. Actually, not everywhere. I don't do TikTok. I don't ascribe to the Chinese Communist Party. You can find me on Twitter, which I won't call X because I don't ascribe to Elon Musk. and on Instagram at Blake Flayton. And you can buy my book at 10thingseverydewshouldknow.com. That's 10thingseverydewshouldknow.com. It doesn't matter if you do the number 10 or the spelling out 10. It's available right now on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble, and soon to be available on ebook.
And Uri,
Yeah.
where can they find you?
Okay. So first of all, I want to wish you a lot of luck with your book, really the best of luck. And secondly, my book will only be published next year, so I won't talk about it. If you want to find my writing, you can find me on Substack and on Twitter, where I publish under my name, Uri Kurlianchik, which is here on the screen, so there is no need to expand on it.
Amazing. Thank you both for taking part.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so that's